Okay, well, golly, are we on here? Can you hear me? Anybody? I'm going to hope we're on. Such an orderly crowd this morning. That's fantastic. Well, look, good morning. My name is, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marjorie Chorlins. I'm the Senior Vice President for European Affairs here at the U.S. Chamber. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to see so many people in our building this morning in person, and also to know that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of people who are watching online with us this morning for what I know will be a very interesting set of conversations. So thank you so much for being here. We are extraordinarily excited to partner on today's event with the embassies of Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. I have to give a big shout out to my deputy, Garrett Workman, who has really worked tirelessly with the embassies and the teams there to pull together this event, which frankly could not be more timely. As the name suggests, today we're going to be featuring American and Nordic business perspectives on the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, and talk about ways in which the TTC can and should be used to materially improve transatlantic commercial relations. All of the companies that you'll hear from today, whether American, or Danish, Finnish, or Swedish, are heavily invested in the transatlantic relationship. Literally billions of dollars have been invested, and hundreds of thousands of jobs exist on both sides of the Atlantic as a result of these significant investments. Today's conversation, and indeed the TTC itself, is happening, unfortunately, in the shadow of Russia's unconscionable invasion of Ukraine. The images out of Ukraine are heartbreaking, and the economic and human toll of this unjustified assault are really almost unimaginable. But if there's one good thing to come out of this horror, and I'm not sure, maybe the only good thing to come out of this horror, is a renewed awareness and appreciation for the importance of the transatlantic relationship. Some have suggested that the very existence of the TTC has facilitated cooperation on export controls and sanctions against Russia and Belarus. What this situation has shown us for sure is that the US and Europe are better off working together to address shared challenges, and the TTC has to be an important part of that equation. As such, the upcoming ministerial takes on even greater importance against the backdrop that we have today. Yesterday, the Chamber and our partners at Business Europe sent a letter to the US government and the European Commission outlining key areas where we'd like to see greater coordination coming from the ministerial. These include responding to China's anti-competitive practices, incentivizing and effectively regulating AI and emerging technologies, boosting supply chain security, promoting increased U.S. energy exports to Europe, and accelerating our green energy transition, securing conformity assessment agreements and mutual recognition agreements where those are appropriate, and finally, reinforcing effective two-way stakeholder dialogue as the TT's work unfolds, so we can be sure that the outcomes that are being developed are both realistic and materially impactful. This morning's event is going to touch on many of these issues. We're going to talk about energy security and diversification, about sustainability, about supply chain security and resilience in critical sectors, including telecom and semiconductors and healthcare. We'll also talk about emerging technologies and the digital transformation of the global economy. Following these conversations, I'll be chatting with Ambassador Wisborg of Denmark, with Ingrid Ask, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Swedish Embassy, and Jani Rapana, I hope I said that right, who is Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Finland. But before any of that, it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce to you Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, Jose Fernandez. The Undersecretary was confirmed to his current position in August of 2021, and he leads the State Department's bureaus and offices that stand at the center of this administration's efforts on climate change, clean energy, health, supply chain security, and other economic priorities, the very topics that we'll be talking about this morning. The Undersecretary is a lawyer by training, and he was at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher in New York before taking his current position. But in a true sign that once you're in Washington, you can never quite get out of Washington, he actually served previously at the State Department in one of the very bureaus that he now manages. The State Department and the Undersecretary personally have been absolutely instrumental in both setting up the TTC and positioning it for success. The department also plays a vital role in promoting transatlantic relations through the U.S.-EU Energy Council and the EU-U.S. dialogue on China, efforts that directly complement the work of the TTC. State has also played a leading role in promoting a shared democratic vision of an open and connected internet, as evidenced by last week's very welcome announcement of the Declaration on the Future of the Internet. Clearly, there is no shortage of things for us to talk about. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the Undersecretary, who will come to the stage for a few remarks, and then I'll be back up here for a short exchange with him. Undersecretary Fernandez, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you, Marjorie, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today to discuss the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council. But first, let me give a few thank yous. Thank you, first of all, to the embassies of Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, and to those nations whose support has been critical in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine. They also put together some great lunches at their embassies that I've been able to partake. Thank you also to the business community that has been working so much to navigate the uncertainty caused by the conflict, and something that we've tried to do is to talk to a number of you on what we see going forward and what we see some of the risks and some of the consequences of Russia's further aggression. And thank you also, Marjorie, to the Chamber for the paper on the priorities. We read it. I read it. It's been, I think, without giving away the story, I think you'll be pleased to hear what some of the conclusions are from our conversations at the TTC. Look, from the first day in office, President Biden has been clear on the need on the part of the U.S. to revitalize and raise the ambition of our relationships with our partners to meet the challenges of our time. And in this context, the transatlantic relationship is essential to a renewed international cooperation. This is a no-brainer. The U.S. and the EU share one of the largest trade and investment relationships in the world. We have more than $1 trillion, with a T, $1 trillion in goods and services trade. Annually, $5.5 trillion, again with a T, dollars in global investment, and that supports more than 16 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. And so that relationship is critical, is key to the health of our global economy. And that's why from day one, the President has been eager and has told us from day one, as has Secretary Blinken, that we needed to get this relationship right, and we needed to reinvigorate our cooperation. And so we did things early on, like resolving the dispute on Boeing, dealing with steel and aluminum tariffs, and also a few months ago in Paris at the OECD, paved the way for an agreement on principle on the global minimum tax. And then most recently, after more than a year of detailed negotiations, we agreed in principle on the transatlantic data privacy framework to provide a stable basis for transatlantic data flows. So in this context, in the context of reinvigorating our relationships, the TTC has been critical. I actually say that if it's been so useful that if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it. And I'm surprised, frankly, that it didn't exist before. It really has been a key vehicle for close cooperation. And I think you've seen some results already to date, and you'll see some more hopefully announced in a couple of weeks when we meet in France. The TTC is intended to promote an affirmative agenda on key global technology, economic, and trade issues based on the democratic values that unite us, while working to reduce areas of friction, trying to reduce the irritants that plagued us for a number of years. It's a relationship that's also facilitated some quick action on and transatlantic solutions to global crises. For example, I think my colleague Tony Fernandez, no relation, who deals with trade issues, will tell you that the connections built through the TTC working group on export controls enabled the U.S. To work swiftly with our European partners to impose what have been the toughest export control actions in history on Putin and his cronies. And those export controls measures that were agreed upon, frankly, we would not have been able to do them as quickly had the TTC working group on export controls not existed. The TTC has also facilitated conversations on clean and sustainable energy, on food security, on supply chain issues, and other issues that have resulted from this conflict. And I think that those conversations, those kinds of results, those kinds of bridges that we built, I think are going to get stronger as we go on. Don't forget, we've only been doing this for about 6 months, and so it actually is. I think I'm very proud of the work that we've done and the results that we are achieving. I think, in fact, the challenge going forward on anything is you start fast, you get a lot done at the beginning, and then you rest on your laurels. And so I think part of what we're going to try and do in Paris is to chart a way forward, to try and make sure that this kind of dialogue, this kind of relationship continues going forward. And so at the upcoming ministerial, we look forward to announcing progress on key areas such as supply chains, on semiconductors, on technology standards, on disinformation statements and agreements. And I expect more in the future. Again, I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg here. We've got a lot more to do. Russia's aggression has only uncovered the reasons why our relationship, why our joint shared future is so important as we move forward. And this has been a good relationship, and one that we intend to promote and intensify going forward. So with that, Marjorie, I look forward to your questions and our conversation. Thank you.
Well, Undersecretary Fernandez, yes, we are working. We've got about 8 or 10 minutes to spend together.
That's what happens when you talk too much.
No, well, I guess I talk too much.
No,
that must be it. Anyway, look, thank you for your opening remarks. I noted a distinct degree of optimism from you about the TTC and about what we might actually expect to see coming out of the ministerial. I appreciated that you talked about the agenda as being an affirmative agenda that reflects our values and is focused on tackling some of the toughest issues and also the greatest opportunities that we both enjoy today. You referenced the fact that there obviously has been close collaboration between the U.S. and Europe vis-a-vis Russia, and that's been facilitated by the TTC. Are there other areas that you can point to where the TTC has already made a significant impact or has somehow facilitated closer coordination between the U.S. and Europe?
Well, I think I mentioned a couple. Export controls is one that we've already, I think you've seen some results there. I think we've also talked a lot about disinformation, Russian disinformation, and what we all, one of our fundamental values is free speech, but at the same time, there's a lot of disinformation out there that we've talked about. How do we counteract it? And I think you'll see some statements there. You're already seeing some statements already. Supply chains. Even before the war, one of the things that the pandemic taught us is that we needed to strengthen our supply chains and that we needed to diversify our supply chains. Well, the Europeans realized the same thing, and I think you'll see work on semiconductors. You'll see work on critical minerals. You also have seen already, and I wouldn't ascribe this necessarily to the TTC, but the dialogue that we've had, and certainly my ability to there's a piece of this that's personal. You establish a relationship, and so some of the folks that I have been dealing with in Brussels on the TTC are the same people that have been dealing with the consequences of Russia's aggression on Ukraine. And so, for example, as we move forward on an unrelated, but it's also something we talked about at the TTC, was this Chinese coercion on countries such as Lithuania. We've seen what the EU has done in terms of standing together with Lithuania in order to respond to Chinese coercion. You've also seen their draft anti-coercion instrument, which is a piece of legislation that they are suggesting as a way of dealing with this situation going forward. You've seen what the EU has done in filing a WTO case against China because of the Lithuanian coercion. All of that, we don't take credit for it. It's obviously their decision, but it's been easier. It's been easier to talk to them about it. It's been easier to sort of think problems through jointly because we've established this relationship, and that's important. And that's something that I certainly value, and I intend. I think we all of us at the State Department, at Commerce, and at USTR intend to move forward. We've built some relationships, and now I think the challenge, as I mentioned at the talk, will be to make sure that we don't just sit and talk. I think we'll have to. I think you'll see some results, and as I said, we've only been doing it for 6 months, but I'm actually quite pleased of how it's gone. I was a little bit hesitant at the beginning.
Were you?
Yeah. Frankly, sometimes our actions don't match our talk, and I think we knew that the possibilities were ample, but at the same time we had to deliver. And certainly in some of my first meetings with the EU, I was struck by the level of ambition that they had, and I came back and said to my team, hey, we've got the bar is high, so we've got to get to work. And so anyways, it's a long way of saying I'm optimistic.
Fantastic. I'm really delighted to hear that. You talked about some very concrete deliverables coming out of the ministerial, and I think you've now alluded to a couple of them. Are you concerned, though, that the agenda of the conversation in Saclay will be overly dominated by the situation with Russia? Or has enough work been done sort of behind the scenes that will allow the principals to come together and be able to put forward some notable opportunities and improvements in the relationship?
Sure. Well, I've been asked that question in the past, and I'm always, it reminds me that when we started this, the question was, well, isn't this really just an anti-China effort?
Right.
And and what this has shown is that the issues that we have to discuss, again, supply chains, are issues that would exist without the conflict in Ukraine, without a lot of the other events that are going on around the world. So I think I'm not concerned. I'm not at all. I think it's facilitated it, but that's exactly what it was meant to do. It was meant to make it easier for us to react, to respond, to act jointly. And so I don't see the agenda being hijacked by the Russian aggression. And that's part of our challenge. The items that we're talking about, emerging technologies, Russia has shown that it's important, but those issues would exist without the aggression that's going on as we speak.
So I have to ask you, because you mentioned China, do you think, in fact, I mean, yes, a lot of people looked at the TTC initially as, was this the U.S. and Europe ganging up on China? But I think officials on both sides of the Atlantic have gone to great lengths to demonstrate that this is much broader than that. But do you, in fact, think that there is opportunity for the U.S. and Europe to collaborate in a very meaningful way in response to China's practices? I mean, we know, of course, that the debate in many European countries about China is evolving. And so I guess I'm wondering whether you feel, as you think about the conversations you're having with your counterparts, that there is real momentum there to find ways to work together, both to respond to challenges, but also to leverage opportunities.
I think that's critical. And if we don't do that, frankly, we will have failed. Look, to start with what's going on now, the PRC's support for Russia has been disappointing. Its refusal to condemn Russia for the human rights violations, for the atrocities that are ongoing in Ukraine. When we've talked about disinformation, something that China has done is parrot the propaganda that's ongoing now that's coming from Moscow. That's disappointing. But it's also highlighted the differences. And I think we've seen the EU certainly react to that. We've seen the EU become much more active in that. At the same time, I think we both realize that it'd be too easy to simply just have constant confrontation. We need to find angles, and this is where we earn our salaries. We need to find angles where we can cooperate. And that's something that, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we had, we call it the EU-US Dialogue on China. And that took place on, I think, late April, a couple of weeks ago, under Deputy Secretary Sherman, who led our delegation. We had a number of people there, and we exchanged views on what we can, on how we see the opportunities and the challenges with China. Those kinds of discussions are ongoing, and again, that's part of this cooperation that I think we've seen has results. And I think, well, I mean, you've seen what I mentioned already, the anti-coercion instrument, the support for Lithuania. You know, that in part, that's just we realize that we've got challenges beyond Russia that we need to address, and and then we'll continue doing that going forward.
So I have one question more for you before we wrap up here, and it's really meant also to tee up our next conversation. In late March, the U.S. and Europe issued a joint statement on energy security. And among other things, it set up a new joint task force on energy security with some very specific goals. Obviously, this is a development that the Chamber and our members welcomed because we are eager to be a partner in its implementation, because the issues that are on the table now for this dialogue are extraordinarily important. What can you tell us about the task force, where things stand, and what are the most immediate priorities, and how can we be helpful in the business community in sort of accelerating the work that's underway?
So it's had 3 meetings since it was announced. We have, and you've seen every day, you see developments in the EU on energy. You know, from day one, we've realized that Europe was in a different position than the U.S. in terms of energy. We are basically self-sufficient at this point. They're not. Their vulnerabilities were much higher. And part of what we made sure is that we recognize those differences and that we did not allow those differences to drive a wedge between us. And so the task force is a way to try and address those vulnerabilities. We've discussed, and you've seen 3 releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. You've seen work in a number of countries, and the International Energy Agency has been quite useful in this to talk about what can be done to reduce consumption at times, which in Europe, which is useful. We've also gone around the world talking to oil and gas producers to see what they can do to ramp up production. And then, there's been actions that we did not expect but have been quite welcome, which is, think of Japan. Go beyond the EU. Japan basically diverting a couple of vessels, LNG vessels, from Japan to Europe because they believed in the need to support the Europeans, and also they believed in the need to have solidarity among the allies. All of that, I think, is being discussed and is as part of the task force. The other piece, and this is one that I've been probably the most involved in, is to talk to our producers here. One of the unspoken, unstated result of this is that our LNG producers have actually stepped up big time. I think in January, more than half of the LNG imported by Europe came from the U.S. That didn't exist before. And so we will continue to talk to facilitate our LNG exports at the same time that we stress that the answer to all this is more investment in renewables. But that's going to take time, and in the meantime, we need to figure out how to help Europe going forward on energy. And that's the work of the task force. I think you're seeing results already.
Fantastic. Undersecretary Fernandez, you've given us, I think, what I think is a fairly hopeful view on the direction of the TTC and the other dialogues and platforms we have between the U.S. and Europe. And I just want to say thank you for all of your personal leadership in helping to move these various opportunities forward. Clearly, the State Department has a pivotal role in achieving success on some of the most critical issues we face today in the transatlantic relationship. And we are very, very grateful for your support and your willingness indeed to engage with the business community as you are here today.
Thank you. And let me state the obvious, which is part of the TTC, and we talk about it whenever we speak to our counterparts in Europe, is stakeholder engagement. This ain't going to work unless we can get the private sector to give us their views and push us. And so I'm happy to be here. I look forward to coming back, perhaps with a couple of things to brag about after the meeting. And I thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the Undersecretary. Thank you so much. Great to see you. So that was a perfect segue to what will be the first panel conversation that we'll have this morning. And I'm going to invite my colleague Dan Byers, who's the Chamber's Vice President for Policy at our Global Energy Institute, to come up and lead us through a conversation about energy security and sustainability, energy security and diversification, and also promoting sustainability. Dan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Marjorie, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to those of you that are here with us in the room as well as online. As everyone is getting settled here, let me also just extend our thanks and appreciation to the State Department and particularly Undersecretary Fernandez's team for their engagement on energy. We've had a number of very productive conversations, and I think his final point that he made regarding stakeholder engagement is really important and couldn't be underscored enough. And so we really look forward to future engagement on all these issues: LNG, sustainability, renewables, et cetera. So as Marjorie said, we have a great segue for this morning's discussion. And let me see, I'm hoping we have a third panelist that will be joining us online. So we'll see if he can pop up on the screen here in a minute. And while we're waiting on that, there we go, fantastic. So joining us is Maggie Lemmerman, Head of Federal Affairs for Ørsted, Matt Armstrong, Vice President of Global Government and Regulatory Affairs for Baker Hughes, and online is Brian Kelly, Vice President of Global Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs for Sempra. And Brian gets bonus points, double bonus points, because he's on the West Coast and it's just shortly after 6 a.m. there. So thank you, Brian. We can hear you? Okay, good. So I think Ørsted, Baker Hughes, Sempra are all household names, do not need any introduction. But as we dive into this discussion, one thing I think is important to note is these three companies really cover the waterfront of the energy system. So we're really delighted that we're able to do that, from renewables development to power generation, oil and gas, energy infrastructure, LNG exports, and looking forward, really, all three are making very ambitious investments in the clean energy transition: hydrogen, energy storage, carbon capture, et cetera. And so I think we'll be able to, our challenge here will frankly be focusing our time efficiently, because there is so much to talk about. And I'm going to turn it over to the panelists here in a minute, but just maybe kind of a quick backdrop and also to state the obvious that this is a remarkably challenging time and busy time in energy and climate policy. When I think back of what's happened in the last 6 months, you know, everyone thinks about the war as a turning point, but even last fall, we began to see an energy crisis with respect to natural gas prices in Europe and Asia that spiked, doubled or tripled. And then that has led on to large increases in oil prices, diesel. We're seeing a lot of movement in the commodity markets. It's all contributing to inflation that businesses and governments are having to deal with. So that's one thing. And second, this is May 4th. I remember very distinctly on November 4th, so 6 months ago to the day, I touched down in Glasgow for COP26, for a very important UN climate summit that I think, at least from our perspective, was successful and notable in part for the business leadership that occurred at that summit on issues from methane and finance, natural solutions, et cetera. We felt the business community really around the world stepped up and helped to make that summit a success. And then, of course, the third major turning point is the invasion of Ukraine, and that's fundamentally resetting energy and climate policy, and that's part of what we want to kind of unpack here in the discussion this morning. So I think the bottom line is that these businesses have to navigate a very challenging environment. They're looking at multi-decadal energy transition while they're faced with all this uncertainty really on the short term, and it is challenging, and governments have to face that too. And so that's part of why we have the TTC, the Joint Energy Task Force, and part of why we're here today. So thank you all for being here. Let's start, I think, just really if we can open, and we'll go with you, Maggie, and just give us a sense of how Ørsted is navigating all of this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to the Chamber for having us here today for this really important discussion. I appreciate you saying, Dan, that Ørsted is a household name. I'm not sure that that's true in the U.S. anyways, but I'm happy to be here representing them. So for those who aren't as familiar, Ørsted is a global renewable energy company that is headquartered in Denmark. And our claim to fame really has been offshore wind. While we do have a lot of other renewable energy development, we are the global leader in offshore wind. But I wanted to talk for just a minute about Ørsted's transition story, because we haven't always been a leader in this space. And in fact, for most of our history, we were actually a very fossil fuel intensive utility. As our former name implies, we used to go by the unfortunate name of Danish Oil and Natural Gas, or Dong Energy. And about 15 years ago, we changed our name and we changed our business approach and decided to take a radical new approach and focus on being a renewable energy only company. That obviously was driven very much by the climate imperative and the need that we saw as a company to greatly lower our carbon emissions and transition entirely away from fossil fuels. But at the same time, that was a business decision as well. We were looking at how can we remain relevant and profitable well into the 21st century. And so this transition into the green energy economy was very much a business decision as well. And while it's been, a lot of difficult work lies ahead of us, it's been a successful journey to date. We have now deployed nearly 8 gigawatts of offshore wind. Most of that is in Europe. But here in the US, we are really excited about the offshore wind market, which, as you probably know, is much less mature than the European market, but offers a tremendous opportunity this decade. We have about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind projects that are in various stages of development right now in the US, which is also a market-leading position. So we're thrilled about that and what that means for job creation, manufacturing, et cetera. We also have a portfolio of about 5 gigawatts of onshore renewable energy operational here in the US, so that's onshore wind, solar, and storage. And in addition to that, we are looking at a number of exciting green hydrogen investments, both in Europe and in the US. And I'll just mention quickly an announcement we made back in March to partner with Maersk, the global shipping company, also out of Denmark, on a green fuels initiative to power a new fleet of vessels that Maersk will build. And we will power that with e-methanol from new about 1.2 gigawatts of new renewable energy that we will build here in the US in the Gulf Coast region. So moving forward on a lot of fronts in the renewable energy space, and sort of how it ties back to today's discussion, obviously this is a incredibly pivotal and meaningful moment as both the US and the EU think about their energy policy and how we move forward from here. And what we're seeing in Russia with the real weaponization of their energy exports, we at Ørsted think that this represents an opportunity to really think about our energy mix going forward and how we can accelerate the incorporation of more renewable energy into our respective energy mixes, and how that helps to create additional energy security, additional energy diversity, and really provides a lot of ample opportunity and benefits alongside of it. So I'll pause there, but thanks, Dan.
Great, fantastic. And we'll get into some of this here in the follow-up. But Matt, go ahead and turn to you.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. And I guess before I start, I will remark on the big brother quality of Brian, the benevolent overlord, peering down at us from above. Brian, I think you'll laugh when you see the images of the panel. But thanks again to the Chamber for hosting, and Madam Ambassador, thank you for convening this group to discuss the importance of the TTC. It's a very welcome dialogue from our perspective. To put our perspective into context, Baker Hughes is an energy technology company. 2 core business areas: oilfield services and equipment, which has a strong legacy in and primarily focuses on upstream oil and gas exploration production, and industrial energy technology. And that is the technology we sell into downstream, midstream sectors: petrochemical, LNG, CCUS, hydrogen, clean integrated power, industrial asset management, so across a variety of applications, everything from condition monitoring for wind turbines to non-destructive testing of EV batteries. Across all of these applications, the company has a single mission, and that is to provide the technology to make energy safer, cleaner, and more efficient. That is a simple statement, but a very difficult thing to achieve for any company, and certainly for the ecosystem at large. That mission manifests essentially in sustainability and climate in a net zero commitment by 2050, with an interim goal to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. And that sustainability commitment, that energy abundance commitment, is effectuated by a strategy that has 3 pillars. The first is transforming the core, so doing what we do today, but much better. More efficient, cleaner, cheaper at the end of the day. The second is investing for growth, so finding areas where the company has core competencies, a leadership position, and where we expect future markets to grow. CCUS, hydrogen, geothermal would all be examples of that. The third is positioning for the new energy frontier, and that is partnering with companies, collaborating with companies to develop new technologies, and acquiring small companies that we think are going to be the face of the new energy economy. And there's a million examples of that span the waterfront. As Maggie indicated, renewables, conventional energy, it's a little bit of a salad right now, really, and it's difficult to pick winners and losers. And so you have to have a diversified strategy at the end of the day to make sure that you're relevant in 10 or 15, 20 years in the energy market. The Transatlantic Alliance is incredibly important to Baker Hughes across every pillar of that strategy. More than a third of our 54,000 employees live and work in the US and EU. If you were to put the US and the EU together, it would be by far the largest single market for the company. It would be the locus of our R&D. It would be the bulk of our manufacturing. And it would be, from our perspective, the largest demonstration lab in the world for emerging technologies. So the success of the Transatlantic Alliance is the success of the new energy economy from our perspective. We developed our first hydrogen compressor in Italy in the 1960s. We're deploying those hydrogen compressors, or not those, my God, it's been 60 years. We're deploying the latest generation of that compressor on green hydrogen projects in California today. Germany's been an enormous supporter of the company and our geothermal R&D for many decades, and that's research that we're bringing forward with DOE and research facilities in Oklahoma today. We manufacture wind sensors in Nevada. We manufacture methane emission systems in Ireland. Our supply chain for LNG stretches from Ohio to South Carolina to France to Italy. So we're strong supporters of anything that increases coordination and cooperation between the US and the EU, and the TTC is a perfect example of that. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. And we've heard both Maggie and Matt mention hydrogen, and I'm assured that Brian will too, to really give you a sense of how much excitement and investment there is surrounding hydrogen. So Brian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dan. And it's good to be with Maggie and Matt too, and it's always good to follow Matt. He's a good friend too, but it's just interesting, Dan, just listening to the conversation a little bit. From a simple perspective, if the sun comes up here on the Pacific, it is something that reminds me that these conversations about energy, they're global. They are not just about the U.S., they're not just about the EU, but they're global. And what I don't want to have a conversation is about something that we all agree upon, which is climate risk, but we should touch on the issue of transition risk. And from a simple perspective, if we think about what does that global transition actually mean? Energy transition doesn't mean less energy, it means more energy. And how do we think about bringing a reliable, resilient, and affordable energy to the global economy so that we are not creating energy poverty around the world, but we're driving a lower emissions, lower carbon, but affordable energy grid? And, sometimes public policy gets out of the way of what that transition looks like. And you can see some of those decisions in the UK, in Germany, in the state of California, and others, where we have to think about transition, that for every molecule or electron you take out of the system, you got to replace it. And sometimes you're replacing it with more, not less. And it's simpler. Look, we have 40 million customers, and we serve 1 in 10 people in the United States their energy. And to Matt's perspective too, and as Maggie said, I mean, we are all about hydrogen and CCUS and any technology that moves this forward. One of the thoughts that we try to think about is the global goal is a net zero by 2050. We try to be agnostic about the fuel and agnostic about the technology, because we don't know in the next decade where that technology will take us. You build, whether it's hydrogen and others, but there could be a leap that we just don't know about. And what we can do is build the infrastructure between 2020 to 2030 to allow us to drive that. But from 30 to 40 to 40 to 50, we don't know. So it's how are we preparing to develop infrastructure that is actually plug and play, so that you can insert, whether it's hydrogen or whatever that is, cold fusion, I don't know. But whatever the next thing is, that we have to be prepared, because our customers, not only industry or individuals, are going to require that. The last point I'll make, Dan, before we kind of flip it to the questions, is we need to have an understanding that we are not supply constrained, we are infrastructure constrained. And the U.S., along with companies like Maggie that are bringing technologies in, but just from a molecule standpoint, we have more than enough molecules in the United States for 300 plus years. The question is how do you get those molecules from the shores of the United States to the shores around the world? So as we think about what infrastructure has to be built to ensure that, is that it's the reminder, and the ambassador made the comment earlier, which is an interesting one. The EU today has an energy security problem. Asia has a climate security problem. And they are going to have to go from coal to gas to whatever the next fuel source is, if they're going to meet climate goals. It is, flat out. So the question becomes, when you think about pulling all the molecules from the US into Europe, you were also creating a energy security dynamic with Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia, where they have to have the same molecules. China is an issue. And so we have to think about that we have to balance both security from the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. And how do we do that? That is a very difficult problem. So I hope that some of the things we can talk about today, but these are going to be ongoing problems. But Dan, thank you, and thank you for allowing me, Matt and Maggie, to be on top, above you there in the picture. But I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Brian, and that's really important global context. I think, let me see if I can sort of combine two questions into one here in terms of initial follow-up for all of you. And the first point is the nexus between energy security and the clean energy transition. It's not always entirely appreciated as we think about, there's some we hear lament, well, the focus now on energy security could distract from the clean energy transition. But I think when we think about sort of the Venn diagram, most of what we were working on and intending to do with the energy transition is also really good for energy security. So I'd like each of you to maybe talk about that, and then if I could piggyback on that, maybe also talk about just the main obstacles that you see in terms of your goals, short, medium, and long term. Is it policy, technology, permitting, markets, et cetera, et cetera. So Maggie, why don't we turn to you to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a million-dollar question. Yeah, I do absolutely think that the kind of energy security challenge that we face today is, it's not a new one, but it's clearly been sort of thrust to the forefront for geopolitical reasons. And I think that, maybe kind of taking the second question first, some of the obstacles that we see, and the challenge kind of has been that energy policy has, to some degree, been pretty politicized here in the U.S., and so it can be difficult for a company like Ørsted that's focused on deploying more renewable energy to have a clear line of sight into what the long-term goals for U.S. policymakers are and where do we want to go. And so I think part of answering this energy security question is having a collective sense of what our goals are and what role we want renewable energy to play. We were really pleased to see at the very beginning of the Biden administration, they set a very ambitious offshore wind goal of getting to 30 gigawatts by 2030. That really sent a market signal, I think, not just to U.S. companies that were looking to diversify and invest more in offshore wind in this new market, but also to European countries who have the experience in offshore wind, who recognize that there are huge technical opportunities in the U.S. There's a huge resource that's available and a very buildable continental shelf and a huge market for this power. But having that goal, having that vision set up for us really attracts and creates the market. We obviously need a whole set of underlying policies to really help drive that, and a lot of that, we think can be assisted by strong tax policy that really prioritizes shifting to a cleaner, greener economy here in the U.S., as well as a regulatory regime that allows, I thought Brian's point about being infrastructure constrained is a really strong one. It's really hard to build new infrastructure in this country, and clean energy and offshore wind is no exception. So having the policies in place that guide us to that and prioritize shifting towards this greener energy economy, I think are going to be critical as we sort of establish a more secure energy future, both here and in the EU.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, I don't see, and I don't think the company sees a conflict between energy security and energy transition. It is our conviction that the current geopolitical crisis will ultimately accelerate the energy transition, but it's also going to accelerate an energy expansion. It has to. Brian, hit the nail on the head in the context of global gas supplies. If you don't expand supply ultimately to meet this growing demand, you're creating a zero-sum game where ultimately the short-term steps that the EU is taking to diversify its supply will become uncompetitive from a cost perspective. And the last thing we want to do is create a dynamic where you have multiple allies, the United States, for example, getting into price wars about LNG supply. So we share the same view that this is not a supply problem at the end of the day. This is a get-to-market problem. The rig count in the U.S. has been not flat, it's been growing, but there is unused capacity. Gas wells that are not being drilled in the Marcellus, for example, because they have no outlet to market. And there is an enormous market in need comprised of our friends, and we should find ways to get that there. At the same time, as Maggie indicated, atmospherics matter. And I think you could hear, even in the Undersecretary's comments this morning, a little bit of ambivalence about the commitment to this infrastructure build, and that's problematic in the market. Financing was difficult to come by before, with an overhang of ambivalence, comments around, 5 years okay, 8 years okay, 10 years not so much. You end up creating significant questions in the marketplace about the commitment of the governments to these outcomes, when in fact, at the end of the day, net zero is net zero, and the 2050 commitments are there. They're in writing in many jurisdictions, increasing number of jurisdictions. They're encased in law. And so, we should be outcome-oriented about this. And from our perspective, that means embracing natural gas infrastructure today, embracing the technologies that could abate emissions from natural gas infrastructure today and tomorrow, and ultimately perhaps expanding the definition of what is abated hydrocarbon infrastructure to include hydrogen-ready natural gas infrastructure. And we're seeing, we installed our first hydrogen-ready gas infrastructure in Italy 2 years ago. We just signed an agreement in Greece to do the same for the Greek natural gas transmission system last month. This is the interim incremental improvement to those systems that is compatible with energy security and energy transition. When we step beyond natural gas, so I'm sure Brian will sing chapter and verse on that, you know, we do see a convergence of interest across every potential technology outcome, which is we got to build things. We really do just need to build things. And if it's a wind farm, if it's a solar farm, if it's combined, you know, natural gas and renewable, if it's, I mean, there's a million different ways that you can crack this egg. But we just kind of have to build it. And that requires both permitting, and in jurisdictions like the US that don't have, you know, a natural market-based incentive for that carbon, you're going to need to incentivize the commercial deployment, at least in the near term. And that means plussing up 45Q, you know, putting in a hydrogen production tax credits, extending and expanding geothermal, all of that. In Europe, that really looks like a serious geothermal strategy, for example, which is low-hanging fruits that from our perspective, the European Union could do a lot more to support. And also, I would say, exploring the potential for a CCUS strategy that's similar in type to what they're doing in hydrogen today.
Great. Lots of good points there. And a couple I'll just mention, we'll turn to Brian. I think completely agree on hydrogen and convertibility of natural gas infrastructure. That's a point that often gets lost. And we know that, I think in our mind, the EU green taxonomy is really a model that here in the US we can use to think about too. Brian, the same question to you, but maybe tee it up with a point, and that is sort of short-term, long-term. Sempra exports LNG and is a really important partner with Europe, and hoping to expand that if we get some license applications from DOE soon, and can start to deliver even more natural gas to Europe. But a point we're making, and a lot of folks don't fully appreciate yet, is that we all know that natural gas displacing coal reduces emissions. But we want to make sure folks understand that natural gas displacing dirtier natural gas, i.e. Russian natural gas, is also a net positive for the environment. And so the Department of Energy has statistics on this, and the one I'll just share is that if we were to completely displace the Russian natural gas that Europe burns for electricity with U.S. natural gas, we would reduce emissions by 72 million metric tons, which is a big deal. And so, and that advantage, by the way, is only going to get better as U.S. companies take more steps to address flaring upstream emissions. And Sempra has been a real leader in this space in terms of looking throughout the supply chain to address emissions. So Brian, if you could maybe comment on that quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And it's always good to, Maggie and Matt, you guys are wicked smart, as we say in Mississippi. And look, there's a couple of points that I think need to be repeated. One is, as we think about lowering emissions, and Matt knows this very well, the United States energy industry from the oil and gas side are 100% committed to providing close to zero emissions of molecules into Europe as possible. Full stop. We know that we are going to be required to, in essence, create green certificates to import into Europe and also into Asia. So that is very, very important, and we are committed to doing that. We've had conversations with, DG Jorgensen. We've had conversations with Dr. Simpson. Same conversation. We are committed to those lower emissions. But Maggie hit on something that's very important too. We are in a regulatory process right now that hurts all forms of development of building things. I was told by the CEO of a very, very large German company that it takes him a decade to build one windmill in Germany. A decade. And when you think about how we are trying to build infrastructure, whether that be a renewable infrastructure or transition infrastructure, if you're going to have decades to build this, you're not going to solve your problem. And, just kind of getting to your point, though, one of the other obstacles, and Matt touched on this, is global financing. When politicians talk down markets, that is a problem. And when we have to build technology that lasts 20, 30, and 40 years, just from a return perspective, if the markets are talked down to,
We lost you, Brian. Can you hear us? All right. Well, since we're watching the clock here, let's see if Brian pops back up. But for the moment, I think folks heard that the final point, and that's something that I think is really important, which is that these signals matter, and we've seen that over the coming months. Is having good, clear government signals are really important to investors in the financial markets that are looking to finance these major projects. We have just a minute. Brian, we lost you for a minute. Do we have you? Okay. I'm not sure, but tell you what, we have about 2 minutes left, so let's finish up maybe, if you could, with A, any final points that you want to make sure that you make, but B, any recommendations that you might have for the US-EU Trade Technology Council on areas where cooperation can be enhanced or should be a priority. Maggie?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just quickly mention, I think, in the space of offshore wind, which is, again, where our perspective comes from, because the EU has advanced technology so far ahead of where the US is right now, frankly, there's a lot of expertise that Europe can share with the US and really help leapfrog the industry over here and accelerate the industry. We've been doing this in a couple of ways with the manufacturing sector. So we have helped a company called EEW, which is a German monopile manufacturer, come over to the US and establish a manufacturing facility in Paulsboro, New Jersey. Same thing with a cable manufacturer out of France, Nexans. They have now stood up a facility outside of Charleston, South Carolina. So a huge opportunity here for European manufacturers to enter into a new market and really help accelerate the U.S. Offshore wind industry.
Great.
I will be super fast so we can maybe cede some time back to Brian, who may be back with us.
I see him blinking, so yes,
okay.
We have him.
That's
okay.
Great. So I would pick up on just a couple of key points. The first is methane emissions, which Brian was referencing, is fertile ground for transatlantic cooperation and definitely through the TTC. The global methane pledge is something that has momentum, it's technologically feasible. The EU and the US are working on regulatory structures in parallel. They should talk about those structures to make sure that they are in sync, especially as we perhaps down the road marry methods for certifying those reductions and all of that. But they could also be quite powerful in concert in third-party cooperation. So exporting not only the technology but the financing for feasibility studies to capture methane emissions and put those emissions to use in productive outcomes. We're doing a flare gas capture project in Iraq, which is gas to power. We've announced a couple of deals in Egypt in advance of COP27 that hopefully will ultimately translate into productive use for that gas. Those are experiences that both governments, structures, the EU member states and the US are interested in. They would be very powerful backers for that kind of work throughout the world because there's so much additional low-hanging fruit in the energy systems that could help meet that global methane pledge goal of 30% reduction by 2030.
Excellent. Brian, we'll give you the last word.
Thank you, and thanks, Matt and Maggie. Again, good to be with you. Just two final points. One is, I think it's very important that we understand that industry is going to lead this transition. It is not going to be government. And the technologies that Ørsted and what Maggie and them are producing is amazing. The work that Matt and his team are doing at Baker are amazing. And it's going to be industry that's going to lead that. The last kind of just from a cautionary position is that governments tend to lag. And when you deal with regulatory structure, 9 times out of 10, you get more of what you don't want than not more of what you want. And when we build regulatory structures that actually lock in and codify technologies that don't allow you to innovate for the transition, that is going to be a problem. So it is our hope that as we work not only transatlantic wise, but also across the Pacific, that we are working with governments to develop these regulatory systems that allow industry to innovate and drive that transition to a lower carbon and a resilient, reliable, and affordable energy for not only just the EU and the US, but for Africa and Asia and others. And Dan, thank you for allowing me to participate from a gray, gloomy California as the sun comes up over the Pacific.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to you. And I think, as you can tell, there's a lot to be excited about, a lot of challenges, but this is a really important time, and these companies are really, really leading. And so please join me in thanking our panelists, and we'll turn it over to my colleague John Drake for the next panel. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. And I want to thank you to Dan and the previous panel for a great discussion on transatlantic cooperation to promote energy security, diversification, and sustainability. And let me say that I welcome Brian Kelly as our new overlord. My name is John Drake, and I'm the Chamber's Vice President of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Supply Chains. The Chamber's is really placing enormous focus on supply chain issues and keeping the global economy integrated and working together. The Russian-Ukraine crisis, COVID shutdowns, what's happening in China are a number of challenges that consumers and businesses are facing today. They're contributing to economic difficulties globally, not just here, but also in Europe. So bodies and organizations like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council are important platforms for encouraging collaboration and identifying effective approaches to keep our economies connected, strengthening our integrated transatlantic supply chains, and creating new incentives for companies to invest and produce on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm very pleased to be moderating a panel with members from very different but equally critical sectors, healthcare and technology, both of whom have a lot going on and care a lot about supply chain security and resiliency. So let me introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Alyssa Albin, who's Vice President and Head of Global Trade Policy and International Government Relations for Pfizer. Alyssa is a global policy and legal professional with 15 years of experience developing and executing international trade and investment strategies, negotiating and implementing international agreements, enforcing domestic rules and international obligations, and executing strategies to pass trade legislation and implement regulations. So her background really provides a very important perspective for this conversation. Next is Brian Hendricks, the Vice President of Policy and Government Relations Americas for Nokia. Brian's responsible for the regulatory and legislative policy and developments impacting technology and innovation for his company, including spectrum allocation, cybersecurity, infrastructure policy, intellectual property, and connected society. Brian has over 2 decades of experience in technology policy, both with Congress and with the FCC. And certainly, last but not least, is Tanya Harris, the Vice President for Global Supply Chain Strategy for Astrazeneca. Most of Tanya's career has been spent working for the consumer product and pharmaceutical companies, including Johnson & Johnson, BMS, Merck, and for the last 17 years with AstraZeneca. Her expertise spans site general management, package engineering, facility maintenance, aseptic formulation, and global supply chain and strategy. So with that, I want to thank you all for appearing with us today. And why don't we start by asking each of you to maybe talk for just a couple minutes about the top one or two challenges that your companies are facing as it relates to supply chain challenges, whether it's something that's due to global pandemic, shutdowns in China, or what have you, and the steps that you all are taking, your companies are taking to overcome those challenges. And Alyssa, if I can start with you.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I think for Pfizer is in many ways, I think, emblematic of the transatlantic relationship. We are an American company. We have a huge presence, of course, in Europe. 60% of our medicines are handled in Europe, and that is a major export hub for us. So the pandemic has been a key kind of inflection point for us as a company. You won't be surprised to learn that. And from the supply chain standpoint, I think it's in many respects our supply chains managed relatively well throughout the pandemic, and I think that does surprise people. But despite significant surges in demand for our products, we were generally able to supply and meet demand. And that was, of course, in no small part due to extraordinary efforts on the part of our supply colleagues. And so I think we're all grateful to them for their efforts. But I think in terms of challenges, I would cite two. First of all, I think we found open trade. Open trade was a genuine challenge during the pandemic, and it continues to be. Governments instinctively tended to close their borders when they saw, a crisis emerging, and they wanted to restrict exports of vaccines and other critical medicines, and that tended to create simply more disruption and, frankly, risked exacerbating shortages and slowing down the effort to innovate and rapidly bring vaccines and therapeutics to patients who needed them. So it was very challenging, and I think we're still working through the pressures that governments have felt to really, again, restrict trade at the border. A second thing that I'll mention is it's somewhat broader, perhaps, than the nuts and bolts of managing a supply chain, but I think it's going to be really critical going forward. And that is, how we think about maintaining the U.S. and European strategic competitiveness on supply chain. What we've seen from the pandemic is that every country in the world is now very keen to have their own pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. And the localization pressures are great, and they are growing, and that is going to create some competitive pressures for the U.S. and Europe, who are, traditionally very strong in pharmaceutical manufacturing, particularly for innovative biopharmaceuticals. And the question to me is going to be, how do the U.S. and Europe position themselves to preserve their strength in this area? And that's going to come down to whether they maintain a policy environment that supports innovation, and also whether we can knit together our regulatory frameworks to make greater efficiencies, and again, build a strong case for continued transatlantic manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals. So those are a couple of issues that I think we see.
Thank you. Tanya?
So I would build on Alyssa's comment. I think we're all challenged with some of the open trade, and in particular, I think some of the challenges that we're seeing from a regulatory perspective, especially with new product introductions. It seems to be a shifting carpet that's taking place across several of the key markets that we're a part of as well. And how do we actually standardize and get more mutual recognition associated with some of the key innovative drugs that are being developed quickly and to our patients. I also think that overall, some mutual either sharing, additional sharing, some best practices that we're seeing across other markets, just opening up some of those learnings so that we can move quicker with some of the new products that we currently have. I think it's important that from some of the best practice sharing that we've been seeing across some of our sites in Sweden and France in particular, keeping a real open sort of corridor of information between U.S. and also EU. I think that's key as well. One of the key challenges that at least Astrazeneca has had is really port-to-port and distribution challenges of late. I know everyone is in that same situation. So how can we open up, again, these ports and also sharing what's happening with these product flows across the business? And lastly, I would say that from a technology perspective, I think it's key that if we could standardize specifically because, pharma products are important and life-saving, if we can standardize track and trace technologies where we don't lose any visibility across the pond, so to speak, when we're especially in pre-registration and launch activities for products that are key to the patients.
Thank you. Brian.
Well, thank you. It's interesting. First, thanks to the Chamber for having us. I was a little concerned that pharmaceuticals and technology wouldn't have that much in common, but in listening to Alyssa and Tanya, it seems quite clear we're dealing with many of the same challenges. For those who don't know, Nokia is one of the few global scale suppliers of telecommunications infrastructure in the world. In addition to highly regionalized supply chains and a couple other things that I will mention, we also have the added dimension of the trust discussion and debate that is hanging over our industry as well. And so there's a push on one side from a security and intelligence community perspective to continue to create resilient, trusted supply chains, which means people would like to see those supply chains moving a lot to certain places. And then, of course, as Alyssa noted, we have huge localization pressure. In fact, I think that's one of the key points I would make on the European and the US side is to focus on collaboration and having focusing principles between the two sides on parts of the component and tier 2 and tier 3 microelectronics manufacturing process that you would like to see, both for trust and other reasons, moved to trusted countries, and then to do it in a coordinated way instead of a competitive way. We see very unhelpful things like Buy America being layered on right now, where you have to meet content requirements. It becomes a very difficult dashboard to manage, and quite honestly, the economic incentives aren't there for us to make those moves, yet the pressure is put on. Like, I think, Pfizer, from Melissa's comments, we had a very diversified supply chain when things started. But when you look deep into what happens in the microelectronics component sourcing and manufacturing side of things, it's also highly regionalized. Asia, in particular, controls an enormous amount of the microelectronics manufacturing in the world. So you're susceptible not only to the geopolitical disruptions, what you've seen in the case of Russia going into Ukraine is there were far-flung impacts to supply chain that people didn't anticipate, cascading down. The very idea of China having a military incursion into Taiwan, which is such an enormously important center for semiconductor and other microelectronics development, itself is terrifying, but the way that it could spread to the rest of the region where there's a significant amount of the supply chain is something that has, I think, people appropriately worried. So diversification is important, resiliency, and being able to work across governments to frame out which areas are you really targeting for movement and redundancy and investment, because you can't boil the entire ocean. Right. There are things that have a trust premium that can be focal areas, but you really need to know what are those things. Are they active components? Are they passive components? Are they things subject to export controls? There's just a wide range of things that need to be flushed out before you can then do an assessment for what's your capacity in your existing countries to expand. We have a proposal looking at printed circuit boards, 94% of which are made in 4 countries that President Yi can see from his front porch. There's a lot of interest in diversification of that. There's very little capacity in other places that we could build onto, but there is some. So you need to identify an area where you think there's huge opportunity, and then between the partners like the EU and the US, you can then assess what your existing capacity is and then design the right incentive package or investment package to target those key areas, because you can't do everything. So I think that my biggest concern at this point is, how do we move forward without those focusing principles as a company that's looking to make moves, do it in an intelligent way in the midst of our deployment cycle of technology, without further disruption, without enormous price impacts for our customers? We need to be narrow, we need to be focused and targeted, and we will need coordinated efforts from government, everything from structured finance support to grant monies in partnership with the manufacturers. Unfortunately, what we're seeing instead is a devolution to very naked localism proposals that are not very well thought out. Move everything and meet the content requirement. And without regard to whether or not that's strategically intelligent for the U.S. or its partners to move certain things, companies are going to start by moving the things which are cheapest to move, not necessarily those things which have the highest security impact or, in the long run, present export opportunities for the U.S. and its partners. So we need a lot more forethought going into what areas would you like to see resiliency and redundancy, doing it in partnership instead of in competition, and identifying a menu of investment opportunities from the structured finance on down in order to help facilitate that move. But it will take a long time.
You know, I think each one of you touched upon localization, regionalization of supply chains, and also in the face of increasing sort of geopolitical stresses as well. And you know, one thing that we're hearing from our members, like you all, is it's not just here in the U.S. that those geopolitical stresses are coming down. I mean, how is the landscape here in the U.S.? What are the parallels you're seeing in other markets in which you operate, like China, like Europe, where there is increasing pressure from policymakers to just basically say, just build it here, period?
We very much see the same narrative, and it's driven by similar domestic political, pressures in virtually every market across the world right now. I think for the U.S. and EU, though, it is particularly critical that the policy choices that are made are thoughtful and that they are good practice for the world. Because if there's one thing that I have seen, it's that the U.S. and the EU are looked to as a model for other countries. So the policies that we choose to adopt, the decisions we make about whether we're going to be open and whether we're going to adopt resiliency models versus onshoring models, those signals will be received by other countries, and they will be adapted to their own political dynamics. So I think that it is what we're seeing across the world is very similar, but I think the U.S. and the EU have a real opportunity to lead and to provide a strong framework that, as the other panelists have said, create the right incentives for a truly resilient supply chain system, and not just a patchwork of localization, forced localization models that actually tend to fracture and disrupt supply.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thoughtfulness is the key part. It's the hard work up front, where you think about regionally. You have labor differentials for sure as part of it. You have massive differences in environmental rules and regulations. So you look inside the microelectronics supply chain. Does it make sense for the U.S. to be focused on trying to bring things like plastics and coatings and plating to the United States? Probably not, right? There's no real security dividend for doing something like that here. So you're going to drive the cost way up. You're going to have environmental difficulties. Yet that's the focusing principle. You can say those are things that we aren't going to target. We're going to target, high-end microelectronics. We're going to target tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturing in these key areas because, for example, there's overlap in printed circuit boards and RF filters between our defense sector and the commercial, wireless sector. It's that type of thoughtfulness that lets you narrow and focus, and then we can partner with the government and say, well, here's where you already have some capacity in the U.S. that could be built upon. Here's how much investment would be needed to create industrial base for aluminum die casting to make RF filters. Turns out it's not a lot of money, but the automobile industry owns almost all of the aluminum die casting. If you want me to make the filters here, we're going to need $100 million between industry and the government to create that capacity. But you can do it in a very targeted way. And now you have created value add across multiple sectors, whereas coming up with Buy America, which I'll pick on because it's just very thoughtless, but also localization requirements in Turkey and India and all the other markets where, like, just build us a factory here and assemble the base station here. And as though that's scalable and not, very difficult. All of those things have massive impacts on margins, and in many instances, we simply won't do it. And now you're left in a very difficult position. So there needs to be a lot more planning and thought that goes into what the targets are going to be. There's plenty of opportunity to move supply chain out of places like Asia to Europe and the United States. But what we don't want is everybody competing for the same four things, and then you leave everything else behind. You cover half the ground you could if you didn't have that type of collaborative approach.
I would just build on what Brian has said with regards to specifically emerging markets. Every market is trying to basically set up a pharmaceutical manufacturing, especially during this pandemic, because countries want to protect their people. But we consistently have concerns, rightfully so, about protection of patents and ensuring that we have authenticity and traceability, because we've also seen a lot of product leakage in some of our smaller countries where manufacturing is taking place, and we're doing like reverse importation into different countries because of it. So there is, again, there is a opportunity to continue to ensure that our supply chain is transparent, is visible, but also very protected, and protected with the use of technology. So if Nokia has some innovative technology, it'd be great to see that as well. And I think that's what's going to be important for the future of some of these markets who are vying for some new products and also new businesses within their countries.
Talking about sort of the key principles to kind of focus on, maybe we could kind of apply it to a specific case for both your industries, right? Which is R&D. As you look at the individual markets in Europe, here in America, abroad, like how can you apply what those core principles should be, within those markets, so that you sort of achieve the policy outcomes I think you all are looking to achieve?
Well, obviously, IP, as Tanya said, is really critical to support an innovative biopharmaceutical industry anywhere. And, so that is, I think, for us, that's sort of a bedrock element for how we would look at, where we invest, where we have, strong innovation capacity. So, and I think, we recognize there's a constant, political pressure around IP. But I cannot overemphasize how crucial it is to supporting innovation. It is what has enabled our partnerships. It's what enabled our transatlantic partnership with BioNTech to create the vaccine. Having that predictable system of IP protection is really vital. Obviously, a lot of other factors go into supporting an innovative ecosystem. You have to have, workforce. You have to have, stable and predictable regulatory environments as well. There's a lot that goes into it, but I would really stress the IP part of it.
Got it. Tanya, I know you were talking about IP previously, but any other principles to apply?
I can't reinforce the importance of patent protection. That's probably one of the key dilemmas that we face with introduction of innovative medicines and new modalities in some of these countries. You're not going to put your brand new baby out there and think that it's going to be replicated or twinned in 6 months when you want the protection of that.
Well, I'll just jump in on the IP side as well. I would say that in our sector in particular, there's a long-standing conflict between technology aggregators and innovators like Nokia about standards essential patents. For its part, the U.S. has not done real well in our judgment on calibrating a balanced policy framework that encourages licensing, and that doesn't make it very appealing for us to continue to share our time and technology to drive the standards that everybody else in the world benefits from. So that's notable. The other thing I would say is skills matters a great deal, and across an industry like ours, you are to some degree captive to where you can find workforce with particular skills. So for example, a big core of what we do is radio frequency research. U.S. universities just simply don't produce RF engineers. So it's not realistic to think that we're going to hire hundreds of RF engineers in the U.S. There are, by comparison, significant concentrations of very talented engineers in Finland and other parts of Europe. So understand a little bit that we have 28, I think, global R&D centers, and I think part of it is that's reflected where you build those things where you have very highly capable workforce. But R&D is also not something which is immune from the political pressure of localization. There are a number of governments that have required, or I'll say strongly suggested, that we should have strong local R&D presences and do the R&D for particular products in those particular markets. They tend not to be markets like the EU or the US, but there are other markets that you can imagine in Asia and elsewhere that are a little more demanding in that regard. So it is difficult to maintain a global R&D presence in many, many markets. So I think governments that have been very good about supporting R&D in our sector through Europe and the US. You have I don't know if we're calling it USICA or the competes, what the final product will look like.
We'll see what comes across the finish line.
We'll see what comes across the finish line, but that's an extraordinary investment. That's going to go a very, very long way. What will be interesting is to see on the implementation side whether there will be conditions on where you do the R&D in order to get the grant money. We've already seen some parties suggesting that you have to be a U.S. headquartered company in order to get access to some of the research and development funds. So it's very important for governments not to go down that road and be in that game. We've even said if you want to condition the R&D being done in the U.S. as an example, we don't have a problem with that. We have an enormous presence in the United States. But you just R&D policy needs to try to the maximum extent possible be liberated from some of these political pressures, because you're captive to where the workforce and the capability exists. And, it's already an extraordinarily expensive thing to do if now you're talking about having to move workers to a different place because you can't find the skills from a U.S. university. So you have to go through the process of bringing a Finnish radio engineer to the U.S. So we need to try to keep the politics out of R&D as much as we can.
Brian, I want to ask you a question, then kind of have it bounce off to the other two panelists, and that's something that you raised a couple times during this conversation, which is printed circuit boards. Mm-hmm. For the last couple of years, Congress, through Senator Hawley and a few other members, have championed restrictions on how the Department of Defense can acquire printed circuit boards for a variety of DoD-related products. Specifically, those printed, any microelectronics component can't have a PCB produced in China, among 3 other countries. My question to you, and then how I want to turn this over to the other panelists, is, what impact does that have on your business, especially on the regulatory implementation side? And then for the other 2 panelists, are there other, very specific sorts of products that you're seeing under attack from the congressional regulatory side?
I guess I would make it more than just about printed circuit boards. The issue is then do something about it, right? It's one thing to mandate that you want a product or a component coming from a certain place, or that you're going to, and usually it takes the form of you can't get it from any place else, or you can't get it from that specific location. Well, if the facts are that 94% of printed circuit boards come out of 4 countries, saying that you can't put a printed circuit board in a product pretty much means either not going to get it, the lead times are going to be 100 weeks, or you're advantaging a single supplier who already has manufacturing capacity here. If what you really want is to use to bring together the desire for resiliency and redundancy in the supply chain, and companies who want to create capacity in more markets to have more flexibility in the supply chain, then what you should do is encourage use of domestically produced or trusted country sourced and also provide financial incentives to add to that capacity. Like I said, PCBs almost works in every example that we've looked at because it is an active component. There's an enormous security benefit. There's overlap between the commercial sector and the military sector for having a trusted supply of it. And you do, both between Europe and the United States, have some existing capacity. It's not enormous. It might be between the two, 7% of the global capacity, but you can build and add onto it. So it works as a great example as a focusing principle, but you have to invest. You have to do something because there's a business case that Sanmina or another manufacturer has to square in order to ramp up production. And me telling them I'll give them order commitments in 3 years is not quite enough by itself.
Yeah.
They're going to need investment. So my message to Senator Hawley is stop complaining and do something constructive.
I love that. Tanya.
So PCB boards, special alloys, special construction materials, from a pharmaceutical manufacturing perspective, we're seeing a longer lead time as well. So, there's knock-on effects in terms of how we can grow and expand some of our asset bases from a capacity perspective. So how do we help streamline, improve some of the geopolitical risks that we're seeing that are actually delaying some of the implementation of some of our new assets across the globe, but also in the U.S. So, Brian has put it perfectly in terms of what can the government do to help ensure that we keep things moving, because there is some stalemate that's starting to take place with active capacity expansion programs.
I'll just add that there was an interest, particularly in the previous administration, in applying Buy American type policies to critical medicines, and so we do from time to time. There's this interest in trying to do something with critical medicines that I think is somewhat similar to some of the things that Brian's experiencing in his industry. But what we've tried to explain to governments, particularly the U.S. government, is that in the case of our sector, procurement, the patterns of procurement globally really do not support that kind of policy. That is, Europe is a much stronger, much larger, more significant procurement market for medicines, government procurement market for medicines, than the U.S. does. And so these kinds of tools are actually quite counterproductive to U.S. objectives because when you're dealing with a procurement market that's something like 4% of the overall commercial market for medicines, and you're setting up a policy that tries to restrict access to those procurements for medicines, and then you look on the other side of the ocean and you've got a market that's upwards of 24% of that's procurement, it's obvious that there is going to be an advantage or a disadvantage in trying to adopt a Buy American type restriction that could be replicated overseas. So we've tried to make that point, and I think, look, these issues come up from time to time. So far, I think we've been successful in trying to tamp down some of that enthusiasm here.
Yeah, just real quick on Buy America, I would say the following. When you have, as we now do in the context of the broadband program, there's, roughly speaking, I believe our calculation is about $110 billion that will be put forward to this great ambition of ubiquitous broadband in the U.S., and we are very excited about it. But Congress failed to waive the Buy America Act, as the Chamber well knows, so it applies until it doesn't. And the guidance so far is that waivers are going to be extremely difficult to come by, supply chain be damned. And our point has been, if the focus is trying to comply with a content requirement, and we can do that by making tweaks in pricing, and it becomes an accounting exercise and a compliance exercise, not something that's going to facilitate a wholesale rethinking of where you're sourcing things. So it's very counterproductive in that respect. There aren't going to be new jobs that result. It's going to be an accounting exercise for a lot of companies to see how you can apply with a component content requirement. Instead, the focus, as we've all talked about, needs to be on identifying particular manufacturing processes, particular components that you think offer a long-term strategic advantage on security or any other criteria you identify, and focusing on those and using everything from, even the export bank here in the U.S. has authority to do onshoring lending. So doing it that in a strategic way instead of focusing on trying to comply with a number is just a better policy. I think we can all agree. But
Yeah.
it's a much more difficult exercise than simply saying, I'm for jobs.
I know we've got a couple minutes left. I wanted to sort of see if we could, conclude this discussion by, just talking about sort of the top 2 points that you really think that U.S. and the EU should do together separately to ensure that we continue to have that robust and integrated transatlantic supply chain to promote greater production going forward. I think there's been a lot of points that have been raised through this, but I guess top 2 recommendations.
So, I mean, as I commented at the start, I think continued mutual recognition between the 2 regions is critical, especially as it comes down to launching of new products and making regulatory changes. I think that's critical. We see a lot of our delays and lead times associated with changing regulatory practices across. And second, the leveraging of technology, trying to standardize that technology that can be used to ensure that we fortify our supply chains between the 2 countries.
2, one isn't so much necessarily just about supply chain, but I think it's more about the TTC dialogue itself, and that is there are a number of issues within the dialogue that are divisive, certainly. And I think I've done at least one other panel with the Chamber worrying about a decoupling between the EU and the US. And so, we don't have a privacy shield. We have very different philosophies on antitrust enforcement. If those issues dominate the agenda to the point that we ignore huge areas of common interest, that would be an enormous mistake. I think there is a lot of low-hanging fruit there to be had in collaborative R&D on things like 6G and many other areas. But again, those focusing principles, the opportunity that exists here is to create a security benefit and a massive investment in new manufacturing capacity across a network of trusted countries. And that becomes really, really important if we don't lose the thread and focus instead on just the things that differentiate the 2 sides and also their own individual domestic political needs. We will miss out on this perhaps historic opportunity where everybody is now paying attention to geopolitical instability is one reason regionalized supply chains are a concern. So too is when you have an outbreak of a pandemic, as we do in China and other places right now, and it shuts down production in an entire region, and you look to see where else you can find capacity. So there's this shared awareness at the moment about the desire and the opportunity to create a resilient, redundant supply chain if we're smart enough not to let the things that we disagree on drive the dialogue.
I would echo Tanya's point about regulatory alignment. I think that's really key. It's a great opportunity to achieve some very tangible outcomes, vaccines, including vaccines. I think that would be a really positive development for the dialogue. And then I'll just say open trade. I mean, the U.S. and the EU should have some very common shared understandings of the value of open trade, and they should be able to find common ground. And I think by articulating strong principles and commitments and also some concrete outcomes that really do support global supply chains and greater resilience, I think that would make a meaningful contribution, not just to the transatlantic relationship, but also the global conversations happening around supply chains.
Great, thank you. I wanted to thank you all for your time this morning and for providing your insights to this audience. I'd like to now turn it over to Garrett Workman, who is going to be moderating our next discussion on emerging technology and digital connectivity. Thank you again.
Seats. Wow, the lights are strong.
Yeah, it's a little bit blinding, isn't it? So I think one lesson that I've learned is that we need to have our microphones pretty close for being in the audience, and I want to make sure. We're going to have a really great discussion here. If I can ask everyone to just keep their voices down. I know there's some important networking opportunities, but we want to make sure we hear from really some insightful panelists that we're glad to have with us here today. I want to thank my fellow moderators and all of our speakers and our co-hosts from the embassies for such a great conference so far. As John mentioned, my name's Garrett Workman. I'm Senior Director for European Affairs here at the Chamber. And I think we're going to talk about some of the same kinds of issues because we have challenges, whether it's on localization or diverging regulatory requirements. And I think there's actually a lot of commonality between the last discussion and this one, but we're actually, obviously going to focus on sort of the cutting edge of emerging technology and different approaches that the US and EU may take, or maybe we can convince them to take more similar approaches in some areas. And so we'll talk a little bit about the digital economy. And as all of you know, there's no company that's not digital, but we have 3 companies who certainly do qualify as leaders in the digital economy, with Google, IBM, and Ericsson here with us today. Obviously, these are the tech sector is a key challenge and an opportunity for both the US and the EU, and an area where we've frequently been at odds, and let's just put it bluntly. At the same time, I think this TTC meeting is actually happening against a much more helpful backdrop in some ways after the President's announcement with the Commission President of a new US-EU data transfer privacy framework. And so obviously we're hopeful that that data privacy framework will be fully in effect as soon as possible, since it will help keep data flowing across the Atlantic. And as all of you know, the entire economy today really runs on data. So let's hope that we can build off that momentum, continue to make more progress on the transatlantic digital agenda, and try to avoid regulatory actions by either side, which might unfairly target or discriminate against companies that happen to be headquartered on this side or the other. So let me quickly introduce my 3 panelists, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So first I have Rita Balog, who's Europe lead for Google on International Government Affairs. We have, to her right, Ryan Hageman, who's co-director of the IBM Policy Lab. And then at the end, we have, last but not least, Jared Carlson, who's VP of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Ericsson. So I want to do a quick opening question for each of you, where if you were at the meeting in a few weeks' time outside of Paris, what would be the top 2 or 3 things you would like to see come out of it in terms of the digital agenda and making sure that we're sort of rowing in the same direction? And maybe Rita, ladies first, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping people can hear because, as Garrett mentioned, sometimes the microphone was a little dysfunctioning. My name is Rita Balog. As Garrett mentioned, I'm our International Government Affairs team dealing with Europe issues, but based here in Washington, D.C. And maybe allow me to start with a nod to our co-hosts from the Nordics. Finland and Sweden and Denmark are incredibly important from a Google perspective. We have data centers there. We have incredibly talented engineers there. They're designing our communication technologies like Google Meet or Chrome or other flagship technologies. And these countries we have a lot of respect for because you have a mindset that is really open to innovation, embracing new technologies. I think Finland was probably the first country that did an AI training that was open for everybody, and also such a transatlantic spirit. So thank you so much for co-hosting us and for the opportunity to be here. Let me start with a really high level. I think some of the speakers mentioned the EU-US cooperation. We did see indeed much more intense cooperation across the Atlantic the past few months in particular, obviously in the context of the war in Ukraine. But also, as Garrett mentioned, the political agreement on the data transfer framework across the Atlantic is incredibly important, just as the Chamber, Google has been advocating for this. And I think it sends 2 very important signals to the world. One is the importance of the free flow of information and data, which underpins all of the communication frankly, that we've been benefiting from during the pandemic, but also sends the signal that cooperation in the area of digital is not just desirable, but actually feasible, and there are very concrete outcomes. So I'm hoping that, to your question on TTC, there are many other areas as well, and just in the new framework, we're also looking forward to certifying as soon as we can. In terms of the TTC, zooming in, again, like a little bit higher level, and also going for one particular example, and obviously we're following many of these working groups in details. There are many interests for us, from disinformation to human rights, shared values, semiconductors, like the other panel was mentioning, so happy to come back to any one of those. But at a very high level, it was interesting to see the other panel talking about the importance of open trade, of non-discrimination, of trust, to be able to offer, frankly, state-of-the-art technology that these companies on the panel, many in the audience, provide, and make sure that customers and users on both sides of the Atlantic benefit from these technologies. And how do we make sure that there's non-discrimination? We're limiting the barriers as much as we can. So at a very high level, I hope that this was confirmed in September in the first statement after the launch of the TTC. I hope we're going to see continuous commitment to these basic but very important principles. And in terms of very concrete example, maybe I remain with AI. After the launch of the TTC, there was agreement on a risk-based approach to AI. As a company, we believe this is an area that is important to regulate, but also important to think about how we're regulating it, and focusing on high-risk use, from our perspective, is probably the right way to start. So as a next step, once we agreed on the risk-based approach, we could think about what does that mean in practice? What's the risk management framework? Is there commonality on terminology of principles that we can agree at the EU-US level, and then set the global standards, as some of the other speakers were saying? I stop there.
Thanks, Rita. Ryan, over to you.
Well, so I think you're all going to hate this very much and be very bored, because those were the exact 3 points that I was going to make. So maybe what I'll do is I'll reiterate them quickly, and maybe talk about some of IBM's specific concerns with each of those, or the reason that we support them, right? So, first, to start off, obviously, we, like Google and many others in industry, are very happy to see that President Biden and President von der Leyen did agree at a high level on political principles regarding transatlantic data flows. I mean, as Rita very aptly noted, data basically drives all modern digital economies, and without it, you basically just, you don't have a steamship, you've got a canoe, as it were, and it's pretty tough rapids. The second point on non-discrimination in trade, especially digital trade, we think is very important. IBM was very supportive both of the US version of the CHIPS Act and the EU version, and we think it's great that companies and regional blocs are really making the investments they need to make in ensuring that their supply chains for things like semiconductors are robust and resilient against potential global shocks. The concern that I think we have is looking ahead, whether or not this potentially puts different countries into kind of a subsidies arms race, right? It's important for governments and countries to make investments in themselves, but it's also important for everyone to remember that the old David Ricardo principle of comparative advantage in international trade is just as true today as it was in the early 19th century. So I think it's important for the TTC to sort of take a good hard look at how their dialogue can contribute to ensuring that international lines of trade kind of remain open, and we ensure that we're not unnecessarily conditioning market access, on either side of the Atlantic based on principles that we, maybe don't want to see. And then the third point, again, I know I'm boring you all at this point, but AI is actually the area that we are very bullish on seeing the TTC come out with some clear deliverables and recommendations on. Obviously, Europe is charging very far ahead in the regulatory front on artificial intelligence. Like Rita, again, emphasizing again, we also agree that it's great that the Europeans have taken a risk-based approach. But we do have to recognize that not only are there differences between how the United States regulatory system treats issues of technology policy like AI, there's also the issue of many other countries, especially in the Indo-Pacific and the ASEAN countries, who have taken a slightly different regulatory approach to AI as well, right? You think of Singapore and their model AI governance framework. You think about some of the soft law developments coming out of, Japan recently. And then you think about some countries like Brazil, India, and Australia who are kind of just getting to the point where they're setting up national frameworks and thinking about how they're going to be moving from general principles into practice and implementation of regulatory enforcement in the future. So there's a lot of things to consider with AI as a potential focal point, but we think that's where a lot of the TTC's attention should be focused from a technology policy angle on their upcoming meeting in May. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Ryan, and Jared, over to you.
Thanks so much. So I guess I can check off data flows and AI. I'll mention those. But first, thank you so much for having us here, inviting Ericsson to be here today, and thanks for the embassies of Sweden and Finland for helping out with this event. Something that we talked about in the last panel, in fact, the panel before that, and something our CEO has spoken about recently that we've witnessed around the world, in unfortunately even in our own backyard, are what we consider to be more protectionist trade policies, and I know you've touched on it. And one concrete example that was talked about in the last panel were the Buy America provisions that you're seeing in various pieces of legislation, unfortunately, and in particular, the one I'm thinking of is all of the broadband monies that we expect to see rolled out, and how there's this preference for American-made components, which, as Brian pointed out, from Nokia, it might mean simply an accounting perspective rather than trying to accomplish what the legislation thinks that it's going to accomplish. So, if you look at the high-level goals of the TTC, I think it could be an ideal forum to demonstrate that we're actually all in this together. Shared values, specialization in certain areas, building on the strengths of the countries that are all in the TTC and other like-minded countries that aren't in the TTC. Those are exactly the kinds of things that you would want trade policies to promote. And so hopefully the TTC has and will continue to foster trust, dialogue, and lay the groundwork for recommitment to the policies that build on the strengths of EU countries and the US. And let me go into a little bit more specifics, and again, I'll avoid AI, but I'll mention 6G. How about that? While regulatory cooperation is certainly important, leadership through that cooperation alone can't be achieved. And so we really see a need for increased transatlantic research cooperation. And like you said, I don't just mean subsidies. It's just to support development of products. We actually want to see fundamental research cooperation, signaling the willingness to make commitments to a stronger transatlantic relationship. So we'd love to see the TTC ensure joint technology leadership, and specifically with 6G as one of the focus areas. And also another area, we do see that standardization for 6G and other future communications technologies adheres to some common guiding principles, and in particular WTO TBT, which is technical barriers to trade. So WTBT principles we see as crucially important as we seek to promote a standards environment that can really promote growth and jobs and research between the US and the EU. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, generally, I think as an association, we're doing a pretty good job when our companies actually usually agree and we're actually promoting those same things. So I'll take the relative accord from our three panelists as a good thing, obviously. I think maybe we could turn a little bit to the geopolitical situation that we're in with a rising tide of sort of digital authoritarianism in other markets. And obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine put this into very stark relief. The private sector has been working, I think, pretty effectively with governments on countering disinformation, Rita, as you mentioned, and other threats. Cybersecurity would be another one that we haven't talked about maybe as much yet. So, I mean, obviously, this is happening sort of organically by necessity, but how do you all think that has worked to date, and what could the TTC do to sort of continue to encourage that sort of cooperation moving forward? Rita?
Yeah, happy to start again. I think the war in Ukraine is devastating. I'm from Hungary. It particularly close to home. And when it all started, we as a company immediately started to think, what is it that we can do to contribute? And we identified 4 areas, and some of it is part of the TTC conversation, so hence my bringing it up. One is, how do we show authoritative, quality information to our users who are turning to our services? So, for example, in the case of Ukraine, there are many people who are looking for information as they're leaving their home, and so we work with the UN, HCR to kind of show their information when you search for this in Ukraine and elevate that information. The second part, which Jose Fernandez also mentioned, was disinformation. What can we do to step up our game to fight disinformation on our platform? This has always been one of the priority areas for us, making sure that we elevate and reward quality content, but also reduce and remove that is illegal, harmful, or borderline content on our website. And this is the methodology that we also used here in the context of Ukraine, which is, removing, frankly, information that was flagged to us by our partners, the Ukrainian government and others, the European Commission. So we removed tens of thousands of videos and channels, for example, on YouTube. And there, just back to the TTC, I think when we have a common understanding of what's illegal, what's sanctioned, it really helps us as a company to focus on that content and act, more quickly. The third thing is cybersecurity that Garrett mentioned, and that's also part of data flow, part of contribution. I mentioned like state-of-the-art technology that is available. So what we try to do here is, one, how do we enhance account security, enhance the protection of our services and infrastructure so that people are not impacted by the increased cyber activity that we see. But also, like, we have programs like Project Shield, which is truly helping. It was designed for NGOs and journalists to help them to keep their websites up and running when they're subject to cyber attacks and DDoS attacks. So what we've done is we extended that program so that governments in their certain circumstances can benefit from it so that they can keep their websites online. And this is, conversations are also happening with governments and others to exchange information about what we see and what can we do more to address. And obviously there's the humanitarian efforts that we are also happy to contribute. So I think, we thought about this in this 4 category of like quality information, disinformation, cybersecurity, and humanitarian. And I know there was a lot of conversation between the US and the EU, and as I said, like common understanding of what's illegal, what's sanctioned, coordination there has been very helpful for us.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I will agree. Everything going on in Ukraine is a horrific travesty, and IBM, obviously, like many of our friends in industry, pulled out of our business relationships in Russia very early on in the conflict, and I think that speaks to the things that private industry can do in situations like this. But we're just kind of, we as IBM and we as, frankly, private sector as a whole are just kind of one small piece in a larger geopolitical puzzle here, right? So to the specific question of how can the TTC play a role in pushing back against the rising tide of authoritarianism and some of the things like we're seeing happening in Ukraine, I do think one piece of the puzzle that's missing there is, to the extent that the TTC is primarily engaged in supporting dialogues around countries with mutual democratic values and interests, we are missing some of our friends in Asia, right? We are missing the Australians, South Koreans, Japanese, Singaporeans, Indians. There are other countries in the world that I think can help provide a more solid foundational bedrock for pushing back against some of that creeping authoritarianism that Garrett mentioned. And I think at the upcoming TTC meeting, it's probably, I think, self-evident at this point that, the Ukraine situation, the war in Ukraine is clearly going to be one of the primary focal points. And so, we're looking forward to seeing what role the technology policy conversations can have as it intersects with what's going on in Ukraine. But I think without involving some of the third-party countries in Asia who also share our democratic values, we're only kind of pushing on half a front. And I think involving those other countries will be imperative if the TTC wants to really, shine as a beacon of not only transatlantic but trans-Pacific dialogue with other like-minded democratic nations.
Yeah, and one area, and let me echo that too, Ericsson has stopped work in Russia as well, given the ongoing travesty that is happening in Ukraine. But one area I see, and I don't know what working group, because I'm not an expert on TTC, but one of the themes that you just mentioned that I think that could be an area for the if not the TTC, then some other group would be to look at, would be coordinating initiatives that the U.S. and the EU have right now to help, promote secure technologies around the globe. And I'm thinking in Europe, you have Global Gateway. In the U.S., we have the Development Finance Corporation, to some degree the Export-Import Bank. And, they can promote secure ICT infrastructure in other countries. And it's essential that that when you do this, you seek to do this in a technology-neutral way. But I really see the possibility for a coordinated approach for the U.S. and the EU to look at individual, whether they be regions or individual countries, as a positive result, perhaps for the TTC. As they, if you're looking at it, can you establish cooperation so that you could, present something of a united front in assisting developing nations as they roll out communications infrastructure?
Thanks. Yeah, I think obviously if we could coordinate on the development side, that would be one benefit, and actually might lead to Ryan's point, more coordination with other partners who might share our values. But I think we do sort of need this underlying baseline of U.S.-EU agreement on a lot of these issues where sometimes it's been challenging to get even that. So if we're pushing in different directions, it makes it difficult to go broader. So obviously this is one reason we really want to see the TTC succeed, and to make sure that we are discussing these regulatory policy items as they come up and not always after the fact. And so with emerging technology, whether we're talking about 6G or we're talking about AI or autonomous vehicles, these are all areas where we haven't regulated yet, which maybe is an opportunity. Is that those of us who bear the scars of the trade negotiations, when you're trying to deal with regulations that already exist, it's a lot more difficult. So hopefully we can use this platform to sort of coordinate in advance rather than having to unwind the damage later. I wonder, and I think that also brings into the fold the risks to our economies, frankly, if we do diverge and continue to diverge on a lot of these digital agenda items. I mean, you mentioned the Buy America challenges. There's similar issues with, cloud service provision from companies not headquartered in Europe. So these are problems we have on both sides that we really need to resolve. So I wonder, and maybe Rita, if you could start us off, what do you see as the risks there for our shared competitiveness if we do continue to diverge, and how do we avoid that eventuality?
Yes, I think there was, the previous panel was very interesting to hear from very different industries how they see very similar challenges. And I think the pandemic created a little bit of a reflex of, localizing and sovereignty and autonomy, and a little bit turning into protectionism. From our perspective, in particular when it comes to our cloud offering, it's very important to meet the customers where they are. So what their needs, their requests, and we've constantly evolved our product and technology offerings in this place. So we have sovereign cloud solutions, for example. But to the other point of the previous panels and this one, it's important that this does not turn into real barriers that prevent companies from offering their services. And frankly, I think it's good for the customers and users as well to be able to benefit from services, whether they are offered by companies headquartered in the United States or companies headquartered in Europe. In particular, like many of these companies are incredibly global. Like we're a proud American company, but we feel very much at home in Europe. We have a lot of, I talked about our presence in the Nordics. That's also true for many other countries in Europe. So I think, like, back to your question on the TTC, I think just reaffirming and adhering to the principle of openness between the two sides of the Atlantic, the principle of non-discrimination, will be important from our perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the risks are legion, right? I might reformulate the question, being the eternal optimist that I am, though, and phrase it as, what are the benefits if we actually achieve convergence on regulatory harmonization in the EU and the US? And you know, I like to think there are a lot of benefits there, right? It lowers the barrier to entry, not only for large companies like ours, but it allows smaller players access to these markets as well. And I think that kind of goes to what one of the big risks that we see are, because we work with a lot of different companies. Most of them are large, but some small companies as well. And the SMEs in this world, I think they're the ones who ultimately lose out on, you know, divergent and balkanized regulatory regimes, because they're not the ones that can frankly afford the compliance. And you know, at the end of the day, you know, IBM, we want regulatory harmonization as well. You know, to the extent that we don't get it, obviously we will look to comply with, you know, all the rules in Europe as they develop, as we do with all rules in every country. But, you know, it adds costs, it adds compliance costs, and then there's always the lingering question of whether or not this could be done better, right? So, you know, I think another risk is maybe the trying to think how to frame this articulately. But essentially, not a race to the top, as it were, in terms of standards and rules, right? So you think of sort of the California effect here in the United States. California, when it is a first mover on various different standards and rules and regulations, those tend to become kind of the quasi-default standards for everyone else, because California is such a large market that it just incentivizes everyone, you know, working in a particular industry to comply with those standards and export them everywhere else. Maybe that's a risk with the EU rules. I don't know if I'm quite convinced of that just yet, because I think the AI policy debate right now is taking on slightly different characteristics than those that we saw with GDPR. And GDPR very, I think, quickly became kind of the quasi-global standard for privacy, at least in terms of the framework it's set up with things like controllers and processors. We're not seeing that same sort of rush around the world for everyone to embrace the EU AI Act framework as it's been established thus far, though. And I think that speaks to some of the success and the resiliency that, again, folks like Singapore and the Japanese have had with their national frameworks. So, you know, there are lots of risks, but I think focusing more on what the possible benefits are is a better way to frame this conversation at the upcoming TTC convening.
To be clear, I firmly agree with that. So thanks, Brian, for approving my question. Jared?
So I think that, you know, maybe the umbrella term is economies of scale. And so I think that that's one of the key risks is, you know, if you see a divergence in the transatlantic economy, in the transatlantic economies, what you'll risk is the great economies of scale between the US and the EU and our companies, which could decrease global competitiveness as a general matter and in other regions. So, you know, I guess turn it around and make it to be more positive, recognize that there is strength in diversification. And if you look at supply chains, for example, you can increase security and resilience by considering the strengths of various industries and the countries in which our industries are headquartered, both in the EU and the US, and with like-minded countries around the world, and not just concentrating on within the borders of individual countries. So, you know, the TTC in its upcoming meeting could commit, or should commit, to making policies accessible to all technology companies that meet, you know, agreed upon standards, agreed upon norms between the US and the EU in order to, you know, add diversification, play on the strengths of individual areas.
Great. Well, I know that we only have a few minutes left, so I want to maybe give each of you an opportunity if there's any other key points that you haven't had a chance to make yet. And then more broadly, basically the question is, what does TTC success look like to you, maybe in the short and then also the medium term, so that we ensure that this platform not only continues to exist, but continues to actually produce things that make a material difference and are commercially significant on both sides of the Atlantic.
So going first again, I think there, just as with an agreement on the data transfer framework, there is opportunities, like I mentioned, the risk management framework, for example, for AI, that I think are, I don't know whether they're low-hanging fruits, probably my experts would disagree with that, but certainly present some opportunities there. And maybe just to close with a positive note and echo what Marjorie was saying at the very beginning on, agreement on shared values and proactively pushing for those shared democratic values is very important. I think the open, secure, and reliable internet cannot be taken for granted. We see a lot of, examples of internet shutdowns and other measures that impact this vision of an open, secure, and reliable internet, and the Declaration for the Future of the Internet is something that we welcome. And I think it's outside of, strictly speaking, the framework of the TTC, and it's not just the EU and the US involved in that, but it certainly shows that an initiative driven by the EU and the US in this front can be very impactful.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to formulate an equally good response at least. I remember Brian had a good point on the last panel, and that is, it would be, I think, important for the TTC to really focus on those areas where there's at least some sense of common understanding, right? Let's pick the low-hanging fruit before we try shaking the apple from the top branch, as it were. But I do think it's important for the TTC to also kind of showcase its value by being an effective convener of those more difficult issues, right? And I think AI probably should be that focal point, just given the stage at which the EU AI's Act is at, and where other developing countries are with their own governance framework experiments. So I would say in terms of the short term, I think success for the TTC looks like actually being able to effectively convene all the appropriate stakeholders to have that conversation, and then zeroing in on things like AI, maybe 6G, maybe quantum, maybe cybersecurity. But for my part, I think AI really needs to be the centerpiece of that conversation equation. So that's what short-term success looks like. In the longer term, I don't really know if I have sort of a vision of what 5 to 10 years out looks like. But I would say if the TTC is still around and it's still having these conversations, so long as they're about new issues, I would say that's probably long-term success. And if it's the same issues that we're having conversations about today, I won't say failure, but it's not a runaway success.
I think near-term success has probably already been achieved. I mean, this is, we're all talking about it. We have an upcoming meeting in a couple of weeks. It certainly is bringing people together to talk about these issues in a real meaningful way. I think that, this is a theme that we've talked about in the last few panels, and is walking the talk of shared democratic values. And a couple of concrete examples, which we've already spoken of, which would be research cooperation in AI and 6G, quantum computing, et cetera. And also seeing those values reflected in standardization work, which translates for Ericsson into adherence to WTO TBT principles, where we respect intellectual property, transparency, openness, democratic participation, consensus decision-making. Those would be, key outcomes for, I think, the midterm. And for the long term, yeah, I don't know. I guess getting away from this notion that's been creeping up more and more about protectionism and recognizing the benefits of free trade. And maybe that's naive, but let's try to recommit to those values, which frankly got us where we are today.
Thank you all for that. I mean, I think we're obviously all pushing in the same direction. Hopefully we remain a steamship and not a canoe. And that was a really great metaphor that I plan on using. I just want to thank all of you for sharing your insights. I think we can probably have a very interesting discussion maybe in a month's time once we see what comes out of the meeting, to see if it sort of met our expectations or not, and if so, why, and if so, why not? If not, why not? But I think we'll obviously have to leave that conversation for another day. And with that, I want to please join me in thanking the panel. And I'd like to invite Marjorie back up to the stage along with our embassy colleagues for a discussion on the diplomatic side of the TTC.
As you like.
It means Astrid in Swedish. Astrid. Okay. It means Astrid. Astrid.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, thank you all for sticking around for what I hope will be another interesting conversation as we look to wrap up today's proceedings. You know, when I spoke at the outset, I talked about the great relationship that we have with the embassies here in Washington with these three countries. What I didn't really emphasize, though, was the importance of these three countries from the Chamber's perspective in terms of the voices that they contribute to policymaking debates in Europe. It's clear that the Nordic countries have played what I would consider to be an outsized role in ensuring that as Europe considers various policies and practices across a range of topics, that they are done with an eye towards ensuring fairness, open competition, and sort of more forward-looking and collaborative approaches. So I really want to underscore how much we appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you here this morning. So obviously, three very distinguished diplomats here with us this morning. Ambassador Lone Dekker-Wisborg from Denmark, Ingrid Ask, who's just told me that her last name means ash tree, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Swedish Embassy, and Jani Arapana, close? Okay, good, who is the Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Finland. Just very quickly, for those of you who may not know them, Ambassador Wisborg has served in Washington since 2019. She is a career civil servant, and prior to her arrival here in Washington, was State Secretary and Chief Operating Officer in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's also served as the Danish ambassador to Spain. Is it true that you have a dog that is a Great Dane?
That's true. I thought if the Danish ambassador doesn't have a Great Dane, then who?
Who is going to have one? So lots of Great Danes running around your house is what that tells me. Ingrid Ask also assumed her current position in 2019. She is also a career diplomat, and prior to her arrival served as political advisor to the Supreme Commander of the Swedish Armed Forces. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. And of course, she's not new to Washington. Earlier, she was posted at the embassy as a political counselor. I understand you've just come back from a 2-week vacation across the American South. Did you bring a drawl back with you by any chance?
No, well, you know a lot about me. Yeah, no, that was, yeah, no, but it's very important to get out of the bubble sometimes.
Boy, isn't that the truth? Mm-hmm. Finally, Jani Rapana is Deputy Chief of Mission, as I said, at the Embassy of Finland. Prior to his current position, Jani was a special advisor on international affairs to the Prime Minister, and he's also served in Tel Aviv, Vienna, and Beijing. Jani, I don't have a fun fact about you, but I know that doesn't mean you're not fun, right?
You can ask the question to my staff members, yeah.
Okay, well, maybe they'll fill us in after that. Look, thank you really again for being here and for your partnership with us. Just delighted that the embassies actually came to the Chamber with this proposal, and so glad that we have the chance to work with you. We're going to talk very briefly about the geopolitical and economic developments underlying the transatlantic relationship, and frankly, how that sets the backdrop, whether positively or in a challenging way, for the upcoming TTC ministerial, and also about how we can work more closely together to address our most pressing challenges. So I've got just a couple of questions I'm going to put to you, and then we're going to wrap it up. So, Ambassador Wisborg, I'm going to start with you and ask you, given the challenges that we're facing today, do you think, in fact, that the TTC is an effective mechanism for deepening transatlantic cooperation?
Well, thank you, Marjorie, for that question. And let me just start by thanking you and Garrett and the staff of the Chamber for organizing this event. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that we can come back and do it again at some point, because
Absolutely.
this is only the beginning of the work in the TTC.
And how?
But I would like to start with the big picture. For many years since the end of the Cold War, we in the Western world thought that sort of free trade and globalization would make all countries around the world buy into our sort of open market model, open economy model based on fair trade, free trade. Now we know that that's not the case.
Right.
And I think that should lead us to two conclusions. First of all, we have to make sure that across the Atlantic we practice this open economy, this open market based on fair and predictable rules. So that will make us stronger across the Atlantic. So, walk the talk ourselves, I think, and do away with whatever is impeding free trade across the Atlantic. And secondly, I think if we do that, we can use that cooperation for being the let's say the organization or the corporation that sets the standards for the rest of the world, and thus making us stronger geopolitically. So those, I think, are the two objectives I see. I mean, apart from all the little things that we want, but these are kind of the big picture. So make sure that we walk the talk, we create the open market, the open economy based on fair free trade ourselves, and we set the standards for the rest of the world, thus making us stronger geopolitically. And I think that TTC is an excellent vehicle for that. We only just started, but I think also we've been helped, on a sad background by geopolitical developments. We're being pushed in that direction, and that's definitely something that we're doing from a Danish side, everything we can to advance that agenda.
Fantastic. Ingrid, if I could follow up with you, I mean, do you think that the TTC is sufficient to encourage the kind of cooperation that Ambassador Wisborg was just talking about? Earlier, obviously, I mentioned when we were talking with Undersecretary Fernandez that there are other dialogues around energy or around China and things like that. But is the TTC sufficient as that platform to really drive closer collaboration on commercial issues?
Right, thank you, Marjorie and the Chamber, and yes, I agree. It's wonderful to be here and that you organize this event for us to discuss these tremendously important topics. So, if it's sufficient, well, the TTC is incredibly important, I think. I mean, it really hits the core of many of the very important issues in the transatlantic dialogue, because trade and technology development is linked to some of the very challenges that we work with every day, my colleagues at all the embassies and I. I mean, you know it yourselves, we have the pandemic, we have the war in Ukraine, we have climate issues. So many of these have a very strong, actually, trade and technology component. So I think the TTC is an important vehicle. Somebody mentioned in the earlier panel the importance of moving from principle to practice, and I think that this might be one of these vehicles where we can discuss all those issues. I think it's very encouraging that the TTC contains so many working groups addressing the wide range of topics, because it's striking. Again, I think few of us are actually experts in technology, but how much we have to learn now about these things, and that it's actually overarching, that it has to do with all these issues: security policy, energy, climate change, and so forth. And I think many of these can be addressed within these different working groups. So that might help us to move from principle to practice in a good way. And yes, that's really the point I want to make, that it's very broad. Trade and technology is so broad, and it has to do with security, it has to do with energy, and it has to do with climate. And I'd like to finish off also by the fact that it's very encouraging that we could come together. I mean, we talk so much about transatlantic partnership, but if you look at the current situation, that we could come together so quickly on issues like export control and sanctions when it comes to the war in Ukraine and how to handle the Russian aggression. I think we can only do that if we have very well-functioning forums and mechanisms for dialogue. So going forward, I'm hopeful that the TCC will help us. We always need more dialogue, but yes, I think it's a very, very good tool.
Fantastic. Yanni, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we do ensure that we sustain the momentum as we try to turn these principles into practices. How do we ensure that there continues to be sort of sufficient political will to drive this agenda forward, given the fact that we're all wrestling with so many different issues today?
Thank you, and thank you again for organizing this. I'm sorry, I'm still focused on your question about not having a fun fact about me.
Well, I know we're going to change that right after this.
I will discuss with my staff about it. But I think it's, you know, the thing is also like that we don't simply have too many other options. I mean, the political and historic moment is such that we have to make sure that we do get the concrete results from the next meeting. It's extremely sad what is, you know, going on in Ukraine, but I think this one is one of the historic moments when we have to make sure that we focus on those, I think Brian or somebody said, on those 90% of the things we actually agree on. For many years we have discussed about the common values, common interests, and now, if ever, is the time to make sure that we get those into concrete actions.
Good. Okay. So we've heard a lot this morning from a range of companies, American, Danish, Swedish, Finnish, about what they hope to get out of the TTC. I'm wondering, I have two questions for you, one related to that and one a sort of more macro question that I'd like for us to end on. What are you hearing from your companies about what they want you to push for as outcomes from the TTC? Ambassador Wisborg?
Right. I think that Denmark is an open economy, technologically advanced, so our companies want progress on all the aspects that the TCC is covering, basically. But if I should name one area, that would probably be green transition. I mean, if anybody had any doubts, we now all know that energy policy is security policy. And I think the work that the TDC is doing on making advances on climate and energy independence is super important. We all know that you know, there are still areas that are difficult for us when it comes to transport, when it comes to agriculture, heavy industries. The transition is difficult. But the more we can create a common marketplace, again, coming back to my first point, where we can share best practices and technology, the better. And I think we also have to emphasize, also in this group, that this is also about creating jobs. I mean, our experiences in Denmark is that we've created 4 or 5 times the amount of growth and the number of jobs in the green sector as in the general private sector. So this is about creating jobs, and it's also about European companies creating jobs in the U.S. As Maggie said from Ørsted, they are from Ørsted's side, they are helping to build up a domestic offshore wind industry in the U.S. And those are the examples that we should advance. And this is also, I think, what is expected from our companies. And then I'm sure our companies would also say that Chamber of Commerce would be an important voice in support of WTO, in stressing how important it is to have WTO to safeguard and vitalize our trade policy system and make sure that we have fair and predictable rules. So they will be looking forward to that.
We are. We're very much looking forward to the MC12 in particular. Ingrid, how about you? I mean, we heard from some obviously preeminent Swedish companies this morning, but generally, what are you hearing from the business community? And also, if I might, what are the impacts in particular do you see for small and medium-sized companies?
Thank you. Well, so we got many interesting
thoughts and reflections this morning. We heard, the emphasis on research and development, on AI, and many of the issues that are actually being addressed within the framework of the TTC. I'll give you a bit of a boring answer because I'll echo the Danish ambassador here. Green transition, I think, is from our side, from the embassy, is really perhaps the area where we can see that it takes both political leadership, it takes not the least a momentum and private sector leadership, business leadership. I think that, well, both from the Swedish side, but actually from the Nordic side, we have a great story to tell here. So Ambassador Wiesburg talked about job creation. I think that's tremendously important, that there is no contradiction between economic growth and reduction of fossil fuel emissions, for instance, and how we can work hand in hand with industry from the political side, and how we can, in particular, I'd like to emphasize the issue of standardizations and creating standards and a level playing field to achieve this green transition and to share our experiences. And if we can do that within the framework of the TTC, that's tremendous, really. Two particular sectors where we've been working a lot, green steel, where you have fantastic leadership from Swedish industry, when it comes to creating, really green steel without fossil fuel emissions. And also actually infrastructure for chargers for electric vehicles, something that where we can work together, just to mention two concrete areas.
Great.
I think green transition is something that has, is very important both for big companies, but not the least for small and medium companies that you mentioned. You have fantastic examples of entrepreneurship where really small companies can make a great contribution, and how to create incentives for those companies so that they're willing to take the risk. What we can do from the political, from government side, to assist in, if we can create those standards, if we create rules and regulations to assist them to come into the market, it benefits, it's of economic benefits, it will make us globally competitive, both from the Swedish and European and the US side, which is tremendously important now. But perhaps most importantly, on almost an existential issue, it will lead to a better world and the climate that we can bring forward to our children and grandchildren. So I really want to emphasize that.
Well, I think that's an extraordinarily important point, and Yanni, it leads me to ask you, in addition, obviously we heard from Nokia, for example, this morning about some of what their priorities are, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how what you're hearing from Finnish companies complements what we've just heard in terms of where they see the priorities. And also, is there a sufficient awareness, for example, across Finland about the TTC and the benefits that it portends, especially in terms of job creation and promoting greater security, especially around things like the green transition?
If I start at the last question, I would say that in the wider public, probably not. But the wider public is getting or understanding fully the importance of the transatlantic dialogue.
Got it. Okay.
So that is something which in the TTC comes into play, that the people really understand the meaning and importance of that dialogue as a whole. Then I would say that, besides the green transition and transition to circular economy, it's sort of, let's put it this way, I would like to underline the historic moment of the fact that we, like the ambassador said, that we are in a position that we can actually create new rules and have an impact on the standards in green economy, for example. So in that sense, this one is a unique moment we are living in also. And in terms of Finnish companies, it's the question was also raised by Ericsson, by the way. It's about not only about the 5G, but it's also like a lot about 6G and AI and privacy issues, and all the issues which relate to green tech and also the global challenges.
Good. Okay. So many of the very issues that we know from all of the speakers are not only important, but I think also Undersecretary Fernandez gave us a little bit of a hint that these are the very issues that are going to be hopefully in the bucket of deliverables that we see coming out of Saclay. So another question for you, a much more macro question as we wrap up the conversation this morning. I mean, we talk about, you just said we're living in a very unique moment, and we all know why, because of this collision of so many important shifts, economic and otherwise, in our world. I mean, obviously, the war in Ukraine is top of mind for everybody, especially in Europe, especially your countries being in not insignificant proximity to what's going on. What are the issues that we need to be thinking about beyond? What are you thinking about even beyond the current situation that you think, maybe there's potential for closer U.S.-EU collaboration, even beyond the current circumstances that we're focusing on now?
Well, if I should start, I would say that I don't think necessarily that the war in Ukraine changed our objectives, but it just made it more important to reach the goals that we've set before us. Because it still is all about, as I said, making sure that that we have a common marketplace across the Atlantic based on fair rules and free trade, and that we use this as a platform for being the norm and standard setters in the rest of the world. So I think basically those are our objectives. We are now reminded why it's so important, because we can see that other big players in the world do not abide by the same, or they don't share our objectives. And so I think that's the vision we should have in front of us. So it's more the urgency that has gone up, so to speak, than the direction, if I may say.
Perfect, perfect. Ingrid, would you, I assume you're going to agree with that, but what would you add?
So I think two things, really. I think the war in Ukraine and the current situation has shown the concrete importance of transatlantic cooperation, that it's not something for documents or conferences or meeting rooms and principles and buzzwords, that sound nice, but at crucial points it can be tremendously important and can have an effect on people's lives in all its aspects, really, and that we are extremely strong together. If we share the values and norms and are willing to work together, it is incredibly important. So really the concrete importance of transatlantic cooperation, not the least when it has to do with these issues that we're discussing today. And secondly, just I think energy dependency is really what we're thinking about. How vulnerable you get and what it can actually mean if you don't focus on your own energy sources, renewable energies, and so it has a very important also security policy component to work on your energy sources and dependency, and not only climate and environmental ones, but it can also have other consequences that we see today.
Yanni, what would you add to that? I mean, a sense of urgency, sort of underscoring the importance of the relationship, and obviously in particular the focus on energy dependency. Is that sort of top of mind in Finland, and are there other issues that you're thinking about as well?
Well, that's pretty much what we are discussing every second.
Quite.
But I mean, what I would like to add is, besides what Ingrid said, that it's also important, and it relates to your question about if the public knows about the TTC. What is important also is like that once we agree on increasing and deepening the transatlantic dialogue and concrete actions, we have to be able to also to make a domestic political decisions which actually support those decisions concretely. That is really also critical for the credibility of the TTC.
And so the hope, I guess, or the expectation is that the public support for this kind of closer collaboration is going to give the TTC that momentum that I was talking about earlier to really achieve some important results. Well, look, I would be happy to talk to you all for the rest of the day about all sorts of interesting topics, but I know that we're running up on the end of the program, so let me just say that I think all of you and frankly all of our speakers have really underscored how many issues there are that animate the transatlantic relationship today. Many of them are not new. Some of them are evolving, as we see, with emerging technologies and things like that. But all of them are equally important. And I think there is legitimate pressure, certainly from the business community, but hopefully from other stakeholders as well, to use the TTC as a platform, not just to talk, but to achieve the concrete outcomes, to demonstrate not just the strength of the relationship, but the sort of indispensable nature of the transatlantic cooperation, and the need for the U.S. and Europe to demonstrate leadership for others in the world, and indeed, as was discussed on the last panel, bringing in other allies who share similar values that we do. So I just would close by saying that we obviously at the Chamber are very committed to supporting the TTC. We're very eager to see concrete outcomes. We're very eager to actually hear more about what's on the agenda for Saclay. There's been a little bit of question about what's going to happen outside of Paris in a couple of weeks. So we very much look forward to hearing from our friends in Europe a little bit more about that, and also to continuing our partnership with all of you as we take the steps that we can and think creatively about additional things we can be doing to promote the transatlantic relationship. So with that, I invite you to join me in thanking our diplomats today, and a big thank you to all of you for joining us as well. Thank you very much. That was terrific. I really appreciate it.